A lone hunter on the Wyoming-Montana border finds a woman half frozen in the snow, fleeing the feared Gray Pass gang. Among them is Eli Jarrow, a man from Ray Mercer's past whose betrayal still burns, now demanding her return as if she were property. But Ray had one choice that turned the tables: stand down or stand firm, and his answer changed everything. And just wait until you hear how this standoff ended, and why justice, against all odds, came out on top. The winter morning on the Wyoming-Montana line was so hushed that Ray Mercer heard the brittle snap of each step as his boots pressed crusted snow. The wind combed the plain in long, roaming strokes, lifting pale dust that glittered and stung his cheeks, a patient barber with a cold razor. The world felt pared down to bone, no cattle calls, no telegraph clack, only that low breath of weather and the slow rhythm of his own lungs. He hunted alone, not for the solitude, but because trust on this raw edge of the map was a coin, rarely minted and often counterfeit. The sky held the color of forged steel, and the cottonwoods along the frozen creek stood like thin sentries. Ray moved in a steady pattern. 3 steps, pause, listen, letting the quiet answer back. He was after meat, not pride. A deer if fortune allowed, a hare if it did not. His mind sifted tracks and shadows the way a banker fingers ledgers. Out here, misreading a line could cost more than coin. He tasted the wind and settled the rifle to his shoulder, the walnut warmed by his palm. A tremor nudged the edge of his vision. He lifted the scope. The glass delivered a shape far off, wavering and unsure, a smudge against the turning white of the plain. Coyote, he thought at first. Thin, slinking winter hunger on 4 legs. But the height was wrong, too tall, too upright, and the movement had no animal rhythm. He drew a breath and held it. Snow hissed along his hat brim. The wind fell into a lull that felt like a held note before a hymn. The figure broke from the haze as the gusts parted. A woman stepped out of the white. No horse, no sled marks, no partner beside her. Her coat, if it could be called that, was little more than torn cloth, flapping like a flag at half-mast. The color had drained from her lips to a bruised blue, and a white crust filmed her lashes. She swayed once, hands rising open to show she carried nothing. Her voice came edged with frost and distance, barely crossing the air. "Don't shoot, I'm just cold." Ray's finger eased away from the trigger. He felt the words land in him, the way a coal lands in a cold stove. Quiet, but with the promise of heat and hazard both. Fear lived on her face, but it shared the room with a worn-out kind of grit he recognized from mirror glass on hard mornings. This was not a wanderer who had simply lost the road. This was someone who had run until the world ran out. He lowered the rifle and lifted his head, scanning for what did not show. Riders, a sled, even the black dots of birds that sometimes followed trouble. The plain answered with emptiness. She was alone in a way that rarely happened by chance. Questions lined up like fence posts. Who are you? What snow did you cross? Who is behind you? But his first motion was not toward the mouth. He shrugged out of a wool scarf and moved slowly, palms up, letting her measure his intent before she had to trust it. The wind found a new song and worried the torn edges of her cloak. She did not step back when he draped the scarf across her shoulders. She only blinked, as if the extra weight reminded her she had a body to carry. Up close he saw what the weather had written on her. Cheeks raw and shining, knuckles pale and stiff, hair crusted with ice, a strand glued to her temple. He thought of the cabins strung up the valley like far lights and of how many doors would close to a stranger who arrived with the storm. "You got a camp?" he asked, keeping his tone plain, as if they stood in a storehouse rather than on an open page of winter. He knew how concern can corner a person. Soft words could spook as quick as sharp ones. "No camp," she said. The sound carried a tremor that was more than cold. It was taken. She glanced over her shoulder the way a person checks a shadow that sometimes steps out of line. Taken meant hands, not weather. Old instincts stepped forward and took their hats. Help, and you borrow a storm. Walk away, and that storm follows you anyway. "Where's your camp?" Ray asked, lowering the rifle with deliberate care, his eyes never leaving hers. The wind pushed a ribbon of snow between them, a fleeting curtain that dissolved in an instant. "No camp." Her voice trembled, but it was more than the cold, stripping warmth from her bones. "They took everything." She swayed, knees loosening as if they might fold, and Ray's mind calculated the simple truth. Out here, winter claimed lives in minutes. Answers could wait, the frost would not. He shrugged off his heavy fur coat, the one lined with coyote hide he'd traded for last autumn, and stepped forward. The weight of it landed across her shoulders like a shield, swallowing her slight frame. She caught the edges in stiff hands as though surprised by its sudden warmth. "Who's they?" His tone was level, but his gaze sharpened, searching for the name that might explain the fear stitched into her face. "Men from Gray Pass," she said, drawing each word as if it cost her strength. "I ran all night." The name hit him like a stone dropped into still water, sending cold ripples through his chest. Gray Pass was no landmark on a map. It was a shadow spoken of in low tones in frontier saloons and campfires where the flames leaned in to listen. A gang that moved like weather across the Wyoming-Montana border, striking without warning. They weren't just thieves, they traded in fear. Small towns whispered about families taken in the dark, about wagons that vanished with no wheel track left to follow. Ray had heard enough tales to know most had roots in truth. Gray Pass didn't leave behind survivors who could name faces without consequence. Those men lived by a rule older than law. Possession was 9/10 of power, and the other 10th was making sure no one could take it back. His mind worked through the possibilities with the same instinct he used for tracking elk. If she had slipped their grasp, it was not by chance. Maybe she had friends who bought her minutes at the cost of their own. Maybe she'd taken a chance while her captors slept, trusting her legs to outrun the kind of danger that usually chased on horseback. One thing was certain. She hadn't been running toward safety, only away from worse. Ray's gaze scanned the open sweep of the land behind her, tracing faint marks half hidden under fresh snow. Tracks wide apart, from boots bigger than hers. Heavy steps not more than a few hours old. The hairs along the back of his neck rose. Those prints could belong to men who hadn't yet realized what they'd lost, or to men who were already closing the distance. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent he recognized, wood smoke, faint but present. A campfire somewhere to the south, too far for her to have reached on foot in this weather, which meant only one thing. There were others in play. He glanced back at her, noting the way her eyes darted from the tree line to the horizon. She wasn't just cold, she was calculating, measuring the same distances he was. Trust wasn't something that bloomed quick in the frontier, and yet here they stood, two strangers bound by the simple fact that both were still breathing in a place that often saw to the opposite. Helping her meant more than offering warmth. It meant stepping into a storm he hadn't seen coming. Gray Pass didn't forgive interference, and they didn't forget faces. He knew that as well as he knew his own name. If they learned he had given her shelter, he'd be drawing a line in the snow that could never be erased. But another thought gnawed at him, quieter yet heavier. Walking away wasn't an option either. Not for the kind of man he'd worked to remain. And if he was honest, there was a stubborn part of him that wanted to see what kind of story brought a woman alone through the blizzard with nothing but torn cloth on her back and the name of a gang on her lips. They moved through the drifting snow, toward his cabin, their pace slow, each step sinking into the powder. Ray kept his eyes working over the land the way a scout does before cresting a ridge. The wind was shifting again, carrying the faint groan of frozen branches. Then his gaze caught a set of impressions cutting across his own trail. Fresh horse tracks, the edges still sharp where hooves had broken the crust. They hadn't been there when he'd left earlier that morning. The woman's eyes followed his line of sight, and the moment she recognized the sign, all color drained from her face. Her breath came faster, leaving short clouds in the frigid air. "They're close," she whispered, her voice so low it nearly vanished into the wind. Ray didn't waste time with questions. He adjusted his rifle against his shoulder and quickened his stride, guiding her off the open path toward the line of pines that offered some cover. The cabin came into view, its roof burdened with snow, smoke curling thinly from the chimney. They made the last stretch quickly, boots crunching over the hard-packed yard. The moment the door shut behind them, the outside world seemed to pause, until the sudden pounding of hooves broke it apart again. Snow rattled from the eaves. Then came a voice, coarse and familiar, cutting through the walls. "Mercer, hand over the girl, and we'll forget we saw you." Ray froze in place for half a heartbeat, his jaw tightening. That voice belonged to Eli Jarrow, a man he hadn't seen in years but could have picked out in a crowd of 100. Once, long ago, they had hunted together, shared camps and trail rations. But that ended the day Eli traded their hired guide to a hostile camp for 2 jugs of liquor and a pouch of coin. That was the day Ray buried his trust for good and counted Eli as gone from his life. Now that ghost stood outside in the snow, speaking like nothing had changed. Ray turned, and his eyes found the woman pressed against the far corner of the room, trying to make herself small. The flickering lamplight revealed details he hadn't noticed fully before. Raw marks circling her wrists, angry and red, the pattern of twisted rope pressed deep into the skin. At her neck, a dark bruise shaped like the grip of a man's hand lay stark against her pale skin. It struck him all at once. She was not some unfortunate traveler who had lost her way in the storm. She was someone's prize, someone's possession, taken and kept for reasons he didn't yet know. And outside stood the men who believed they had the right to reclaim her, the kind who would ride through a blizzard for no other reason than to finish what they'd started. Ray understood the stakes instantly. This was no chance encounter, no harmless bit of frontier trouble that could be set right with a few words. If he sent her back, he'd be doing the work of the men outside for them. If he refused, he'd be drawing a line across which there would be no return. The wind rattled the shutters like fingers tapping a warning, but he stayed still, listening to the hoofbeats shift as the riders spread out in the snow. The game had already begun, and now it was his move. Ray stepped to the door, with the rifle steady in his grip, the wood grain cool against his palm. He knew every board and nail of this cabin, had built it to withstand storms and worse. The cold air seeping through the cracks smelled of pine and iron. Without taking his eyes from the door, he called out, his voice carrying clear into the white silence beyond. "Eli," he said, each syllable deliberate, "your hunting season's closed." For a long moment there was nothing, no movement, no reply, only the hiss of wind threading through the trees. Then came the faint rustle of leather and the muted clink of tack, followed by the soft but certain sound of horses turning away. The hoofbeats grew distant, fading toward the line of dark timber until they were swallowed by the forest's quiet. Ray listened for another full minute, his breathing slow, until the silence felt honest. He lowered the rifle but kept it within reach, the weight still familiar in his hands. Behind him, the woman had slid down to sit on the plank floor, the heavy fur coat wrapped tightly around her like a shield she wasn't ready to set aside. For the first time since he'd seen her step out of the snow, her face softened. A faint curve touched her lips, not joy, but the fragile recognition that she was still here, still breathing. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice quiet enough to keep the question between them alone. Ray turned toward her, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. He gave a small shrug, the kind that carried more weight than the gesture let on. "Because once," he said, "I was lucky enough that someone didn't pull the trigger." The truth of it was plain, and he left it there, without inviting questions about who or when. Outside, the storm was breaking. The wind eased into a softer hum, and the snow fell in slower, heavier flakes that drifted without urgency. Through the window, the horizon had begun to lose its sharp edges, the world settling into the kind of stillness that could lull a man into thinking the danger had passed. But both of them knew better. She pulled the coat closer, not just for warmth, but as if holding on to the moment itself. The strange safety of this small room against the wide, uncertain cold outside. Ray leaned the rifle by the door, his mind already turning over the next hours, the next miles. He knew the riders might circle back, and he knew Gray Pass didn't leave loose ends. And yet, for the first time in longer than he could remember, his chest felt lighter. It wasn't the false comfort of a temporary victory. It was the quiet sense that, for once, his choice had tilted toward what was right, instead of simply what kept him alive. He met her gaze across the room, and saw something there he hadn't expected, an ember of hope, small but steady, refusing to go out. In that silence, with the fire's glow stretching shadows along the walls, Ray understood that whatever came next, they would face it with more than just survival in mind.